Sometimes people think of God as the author of all the things that go wrong in their lives. They see God sitting in heaven orchestrating events just to make their lives difficult. But God often allows bad things to happen in our lives in order to test us. Tests are for our benefit. Tests make us stronger if we pass them. Tests increase our confidence if we pass them. In a few minutes, we'll read about an occasion when the disciples of Christ were on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus was not in the boat with them. They found themselves struggling against the wind and the waves. They probably felt abandoned by the Lord. Have you ever felt like God has abandoned you? Have you ever felt like the whole world was against you? Have you ever felt like God must be picking on you, that He's just out to get you? We tend to feel apprehension rather than assurance when we ask, why did this have to happen? Referring to the past. Or what am I going to do now? Regarding the present. Or who's going to take care of me? Concerning the future. This apprehension is something the apostles surely felt as they fought against the waves as they struggled alone on the Sea of Galilee one night. We're going to look at Matthew's account of Jesus walking on the water. It's found in Matthew chapter 14. Christ had just fed the 5,000, and He had sent the disciples across the lake while He went up on a mountain to pray. We pick up in the text Matthew 14, beginning in verse 22. We read, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of Him to the other side while He dismissed the crowd. After He had dismissed them, He went up on a mountainside by Himself to pray. Later that night He was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, tossed or buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it." The disciples got into a struggle against the wind, just as we often find ourselves in one of life's storms. The text does not call it a storm, but the word tossed in verse 24 is a word which means to torture. And so the boat was tortured or tormented by the waves. It was caught in the throes of agony. Picking up again in verse 25, in the New King James Version, it says, "Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea." The fourth watch of the night was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. And of course the New International Version is more helpful when it says, "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake." Then in verse 26, reading through verse 33, it says, "When the disciples saw Him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they cried. They said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid.' 'Lord, if it's you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come on to you on the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out His hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' He said, 'why did you doubt?' And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped Him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" Based on this text, I'm going to suggest 5 reasons why we need to be confident in the Lord when storms occur in our lives. So when life's storms come upon you, you need to be confident that He brought you here. Storms of life appear primarily for one of 2 reasons. There are storms of correction. You can ask Jonah about that kind. If we're out of the Lord's will, He will use a storm to bring us back to where we need to be. Storms of correction are for the purpose of disciplining us or training us. Then there are what we might call storms of perfection. These storms are designed to develop us. In this passage, the disciples were obeying Jesus' command to go to the other side. And so this storm was not to correct them. It was a storm to perfect them, to help them grow. In this storm, Jesus was saying, "I've been with you. I've been teaching you. Now I'm going to test you. So you can get into a storm while you're right in the center of God's will. The disciples were doing exactly what the Lord had told them to do. So problems are not a sure sign of God's displeasure. Problems in life are not proof that you've done something wrong. Consult the book of Job on that matter. We need to learn that faith is strengthened through struggle. Faith says, I will do what the Lord says even though a storm is headed my way. I will do what the Lord says even if it leads me into a storm. Even though it means there will be difficulties, obstacles, and challenges, even though it may be brutal, I will obey. Such struggles help us grow, and it's important to realize that faith is obeying in spite of the consequences. So there is a purpose to our being in the storm. Sometimes God puts us in a storm to prepare us for new service. Sometimes He puts us in a storm to draw us closer to each other. Sometimes He puts us in a storm to draw us closer to Him. When life storms come upon you, you need to be confident that He is mindful of you. Christ knew where the apostles were, and He knew what was going on. They thought He was on the shore, and maybe they thought they'd never see Him again. But Christ knew exactly what was happening. His prayer doubtlessly included them. In verse 23, it says, after He had dismissed them, He went up on a mountainside by Himself to pray. To think that He was unaware of what was happening would be unthinkable. This would not be the first time or the last time that God brought about a storm of some kind, so Christ could show His power and help confirm His identity. From the days of Moses, God has promised His people, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31 verses 6 and 8 says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Verse 8, the Lord Himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 5 says, no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Hebrews 13 verse 5 says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. When times are good and when times are bad, the Lord is always mindful of you. When life's storms come upon you, you need to be confident that He will come to you. If you feel deserted in the midst of life's storms, be confident that God comes at the darkest hours to teach us not to depend on circumstances. God came to Elijah in his distress. God came to Gideon when things seemed the bleakest. The Lord came to Jonah when death had swallowed him up. Storms are never pleasant experiences, but we remember His promise. The Lord Himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. He will come to you. But the thing that frightens us is often Christ's way of coming nearer to us. He will often use the vehicle of the storm. We want to grow, but we often don't like the means by which we must grow. But we can't grow stronger by staying on the shore in safety. It's only when we face the waves and the contrary winds, putting our trust in Him, that our faith is strengthened. When Christ came to the disciples, we might ask, why didn't they recognize Him? One reason is because they weren't looking for Him, not there walking on the water anyway. Another reason they didn't recognize Him is because they were afraid, and when we're afraid, we often jump to the worst possible conclusion. We see the worst possibilities as realities. It simply could not be someone walking on the water, so it had to be something else. When God has allowed a storm to come upon us to interfere with our lives, and I put interfere in quotations there, to interfere with our lives. Too often we're trying so hard to find our own way out of the storm that we fail to see Christ reaching out his hand to help us through the storm. The silver lining is that storms are often a prelude to blessings. The blessing comes after the storm. The Lord may not come when you think he should, but he will come when the time is right. In this account, he waited until they were an estimated 3 to 3.5 miles from land, where it was humanly impossible for them to rescue themselves in terms of saving the ship and possibly saving their own lives. Be confident he will come to you. When life storms come upon you, you need to be confident that he will help you grow. Christ tries to teach us to trust him. Jesus spoke only one word to Peter in verse 28. Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Then in verse 29, Jesus merely said, "Come." The text then tells us that Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Peter's walk on the water in the storm and in the dark with his eyes on Jesus defines the Christian life. Peter sank because he took his eyes off the Lord. But we really shouldn't be too harsh towards Peter. He had one word, and he stepped out and walked on the water. We have the whole Bible, and sometimes we can't walk on the sidewalk. As on other occasions, Peter had not thought of the difficulties he might face, and he committed himself beyond what he was able to achieve. There are things we can learn from Peter's failure. We learn that Peter's faith was challenged when he saw the effects of the wind. Obstacles are what you see when you take your eyes off the Lord. Trials look more difficult. Obstacles appear larger. Enemies seem stronger when our focus is on the trials, the obstacles, and the enemies. We don't enjoy the storms, but God uses the storms to help us grow. The storms of life are not easy, but they are necessary. They help wean us from this world and point us to the next. And when life storms come upon you, you need to be confident that he will see you through. Hebrews 11 verse 1 says, "Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." The New International Version says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see." What is assurance, and where is it found? Assurance is defined as a statement or indication that inspires confidence. Assurance not only holds us firm, but assurance also prods us to go on. Assurance in the midst of the storm is sometimes a rare commodity. Several years ago, one of the astronauts who walked on the moon was interviewed and was asked, "What did you think about as you stood on the moon and looked back on the Earth?" The astronaut replied, "I remembered how the spacecraft was built by the lowest bidder." That's not a lot of assurance. From the passage we just read, faith is the assurance of things hoped for. And so faith and assurance are inextricably linked. In verse 31, Jesus said to Peter, "O you of little faith." In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus had previously tied little faith to anxiety about daily needs. In chapter 6, verse 30, Jesus said there, "Now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith?" And little faith is tied to fear. For example, in the midst of a previous storm at sea in chapter 8 and verse 26, Jesus said to them, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" Now here in Matthew 14, Jesus connects little faith to Peter's wavering faith, his doubt, his lack of assurance in the midst of a trial. Jesus asked why Peter doubted. The word translated doubt here means to be divided in two. Faith requires a single-minded focus on Christ that must not be distracted by circumstances. Because Peter allowed his attention to be diverted from the source of his strength, his faith was not equal to the crisis. Christ will bring you out of the storm. As a result of going through the storm, you will get to know him better. As a result of this encounter, the disciples proclaimed Jesus to be the Son of God. They said in verse 33, "Truly you are the Son of God." Keep your eyes on him in his word, and you will safely reach the shore. We tend to want factual assurance of God's presence, of God's care, of God's help. We want proof. We want empirical evidence. A fact is something that's capable of being demonstrated or proved. When Peter became afraid, he called out to the Lord to help him. Peter wasn't looking to man for assurance. He was facing a time when nobody but the Lord would do. Isaiah 25 verse 1 says, "O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you, I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things. Your counsels of old are faithfulness and truth." We often find ourselves in a storm, sometimes one storm after another. We need to remember that we often get in the way of our own progress. We need to remember that God brought us here. We need to remember that he knows we are here. We need to remember that he will come to us. And we need to remember that he will see us through. But we also need to remember that he wants us to grow in the storm. He wants us to become better, stronger, and more faithful to him. He wants us to remember that storms are just vehicles to accomplish those very purposes.